She called the cops on my fence. Not a party, not a weapon. My fence. Said it threatened safety, disrupted the aesthetic balance, and might cause emotional damage to the geese. As if planks of cedar had joined a militia. I looked up, and there she was. Janice Bellamy, neighborhood Napoleon with a cloth tape, fake badge energy, and a clipboard that thought it was the Supreme Court. What followed wasn't a conversation. It was a full-blown HOA theater production, starring her as president, judge, and emotional support enforcer of an HOA that doesn't even legally exist. You think I'm joking? It only gets weirder from here. Ever dealt with a neighbor so obsessed with standards they forget about sanity? Tell me your craziest HOA run-in. Mine came with citations printed in Comic Sans. Now look, I didn't build the fence to start a civil war. I bought this cabin to write in peace. I'd spent the past decade trying to finish a series of murder mysteries, while my neighbors back in the city reenacted Fast and Furious leaf blower drift. So when I found this place, quiet, remote, with wraparound views and not a Tesla in sight, I figured I'd finally found my writing sanctuary. The only problem? Tourists. Turns out, the cabin sits right on a popular trail, and nothing ruins a tense plot twist like a stranger pressing their face against your office window while licking a popsicle. I tried ignoring them. I even waved once. But when someone brought a selfie stick and narrated my typing to their followers, I'd had enough. So I did the legal, adult thing. I pulled permits, hired a contractor, and built a privacy fence. Clean lines, 6 feet, cedar panels, nothing flashy. For 72 hours, it was paradise. And then she arrived. Janice, mid-40s, corporate blouse at a fishing lake, clipboard held like a weapon. She stomped through the gravel like she'd just been summoned to restore order. I stepped outside, and she didn't waste a breath. "Mr. Riddell, this structure violates community code. You need to remove it within 24 hours. I told her it was legally permitted and approved by the county. Her response? "Permits don't apply when the Lake Echo Property Preservation Society deems something non-compliant." That name? Property Preservation Society? Sounded like something invented during a wine-fueled HOA fan fiction session. I asked for documents. She flashed a sheet with a logo that looked like it was whipped up in PowerPoint 2003 and printed on resume paper. I pointed out there was no HOA on record, no board, and nothing in my real estate paperwork. "That's because we're exclusive," she said, as if fraud was a feature. At this point, she whipped out her sewing tape, yes, a sewing tape, and started measuring the fence like she was defusing a bomb. She muttered things like view corridor disruption and emergency vehicle clearance, even though the fence sat 15 feet from the road and nowhere near any access route. I asked her again for credentials, bylaws, or a board contact. "You'll get everything you need in writing after the removal," she snapped. Then she dropped the line that made me realize I wasn't dealing with a neighbor. I was dealing with an ego in khakis. "This lake has traditions, and your fence is not one of them." And with that, she stormed off down the road like she'd just executed a citizen's arrest on my cedar panels. Clipboard clutched tight, she yelled back, "This isn't over!" like a villain in a made-for-TV movie about suburban power trips. That night, I sat on my porch with a cold drink, staring at my beautiful, straight, code-compliant fence, and wondered what kind of neighborhood I'd wandered into. I typed Lake Echo Property Preservation Society into Google. Nothing. I searched county records. Nothing. Even Zillow listings from the area didn't mention any HOA or community rules. But Janice had shown up like she was the sheriff of a town that never hired one. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about fences or permits. It was about control. And Janice? She wasn't trying to preserve property. She was trying to preserve her own sense of authority. One clipboard citation at a time. I thought the drama was over. But the next morning I heard the unmistakable voice of Janice echoing through the trees. She was outside on the phone, loudly reporting a public safety hazard. My fence, apparently, was now an emergency. And that, my friend, is when things went from bizarre to downright operatic. The morning after her clipboard tirade, I did what any rational adult would do when confronted by self-declared authority. I Googled it. Lake Echo Property Preservation Society. 0 results. I tried every combination. Lake Echo HOA, Lake Echo Community Board, even Lake Echo Janice Bellamy, and got nothing but property listings and a crock-pot chili recipe from 2011. No Facebook page. No registry with the county, not a single meeting minute, email trail, or legally binding anything. It was like chasing Bigfoot in a pantsuit. What kind of organization has 0 digital footprint in 2025? My dental hygienist has a website. The more I searched, the more it smelled like fiction. The only structure Janice had any real authority over was the fantasy in her head. And yet, that fantasy was marching around like it could find people into bankruptcy. I hadn't even reached for my coffee yet, and already I could feel a storm building, and not the weather kind. By noon, it arrived in the form of a letter. Certified mail, fancy envelope, violation notice, matter. I opened it, half expecting glitter or a cease and desist drawn in crayon. Inside was a letterhead with an eagle clip art watermark, a fake seal that looked like it had been cropped out of a middle school civics poster, and the infamous phrase, "You are in violation of Community Regulation 4B." Regulation 4B. There was no 1A, no bylaws, no code book, just a line stating I owed a $500 0 cents fine for unauthorized fencing and a warning that daily penalties would begin immediately if I didn't comply. Oh, and the text was in Comic Sans. I didn't know whether to laugh or call a graphic designer. It wasn't a legal notice, it was design malpractice. I stared at the page, wondering how someone with a working printer and no shame could stir up so much. And then I realized something worse. If she'd mailed one to me, she probably mailed 10 more. She was impersonating a government body with clip art. I didn't have long to stew on it. At exactly 8:47 a.m. the next morning, while I was halfway through plotting the 3rd chapter of a murder mystery, I heard a voice carrying across the lake like a foghorn, full of drama. "There is a safety hazard at Lake Echo Drive. I need police assistance immediately." It was Janice, again, this time stage whispering her 911 call loud enough for migrating birds to file a complaint. She claimed the fence was blocking emergency services and that children were at risk. Children? I'd seen more wildlife than human life since I moved in. I peeked through the blinds and saw her standing near the road, flanked by her trusty clipboard and measuring tape, like she was commanding an HOA-themed episode of Law and Order. She wasn't calling for help, she was auditioning for attention. And based on how she was projecting, she wanted the entire lake to know that her one-woman government was taking action. That phone call wasn't about safety, it was a performance. And unfortunately, it worked. Officer Bradley Kane pulled into my driveway an hour later. He had the kind of face that looked like it had mediated 20 too many neighborhood arguments over tree limbs and barking dogs. Calm, polite, with the same tired patience you'd expect from someone who'd rather be anywhere else but knows paperwork's coming no matter what. "Good morning, sir," he said as I met him halfway down the path. "We got a call about a possible obstruction. Mind if I take a look?" I showed him the fence, the permits, the build specs, everything done by the book. He nodded, took notes, and then Janice emerged from the bushes like she'd been lying in wait, ready to pounce. "Officer!" she shouted, marching up like she'd been cast in a low-budget HOA procedural. "This structure violates architectural standards and threatens visibility for emergency vehicles." She waved her cloth tape measure like it was a subpoena. That was her weapon of choice, fabricant fumes. What followed was the strangest inspection I've ever witnessed. Janice pointed at fence boards like they were radioactive. She claimed ambulances couldn't make it up driveways that were a good 30 feet wide. She insisted the structure created a driving hazard, even though the fence was 15 feet off the road, with sight lines clearer than a window showroom. Officer Kane measured everything using professional equipment, walked the perimeter, and double-checked visibility angles. His conclusion was simple: no hazard, no violation, no problem. But Janice wasn't going down without a spectacle. She demanded he use her tape measure instead of his biased police-issued tool. "Ma'am," he said, with a patience I wish I could bottle, This is a calibrated law enforcement device. Your sewing tape is not a legal measurement tool." She was livid. Tried to argue that her tape showed 6'2" instead of 6 feet. Officer Kane calmly responded that even if her number were accurate, it would still be under the legal height limit. I quietly recorded the conversation, just in case she decided to rewrite history later, and because, frankly, no one would have believed me without proof. But even as the officer wrapped up and headed back to his cruiser, I knew this wasn't over. Janice didn't believe in closure. She believed in control. And the fact that the law didn't back her up? That just meant she was going to take things even further. Just when I thought things couldn't possibly get more ridiculous than Janice arguing with a trained police officer about the accuracy of her cloth tape measure, she raised the bar, or rather dropped it through the floor. 2 days after Officer Kane confirmed my fence was fully compliant, Janice dialed 911 again, this time declaring that my fence was built across her property line and that I was, in her words, stealing land by lumber. I didn't even know that phrase could exist. But according to her, I had committed a boundary violation, so severe it warranted police involvement and a licensed surveyor. That was her new angle, not just safety or aesthetics, but theft. Because if there's one thing a clipboard dictator hates more than being ignored, it's losing control of imaginary borders. Enter Chase, the licensed surveyor. I put that in quotes because he showed up wearing an oversized orange vest that looked like it belonged to someone else, carrying a plastic measuring wheel straight from aisle 5 of a hardware store, and gripping his clipboard like it might escape. He couldn't have been more than 22, baby-faced, with the posture of someone who desperately didn't want to be there. I knew something was off the moment he arrived. Real surveyors don't usually shake while writing their name. He paced nervously by the fence while Janice stood nearby, barking instructions like a director at a middle school play. And sure enough, out of nowhere, Officer Kane returned. Again. At this point, the man probably had my driveway mapped into his... Kane stepped out of his cruiser with that same tired expression, the kind you wear when you're 99% sure the call you just answered is nonsense, but protocol requires you to show up anyway. He greeted me, looked over at the surveyor, and then asked the most reasonable question of the morning. "Son, may I see your certification?" You could almost hear Chase's soul leave his body. His hands shook, his lips opened, then closed. He looked at Janice, who stiffened like she'd just been asked to surrender her microphone. Chase mumbled, "It's in the truck," then added, "Or maybe I left it at the office." That's when Janice leaned in and whispered, loud enough for everyone within 10 feet to hear. "Just say he crossed the line?" "You want us to get sued again?" That again wasn't lost on Officer Kane. His eyebrows lifted, and suddenly this fake inspection started unraveling faster than a roll of off-brand duct tape in a thunderstorm. What neither Janice nor Chase realized was that they weren't alone. Our lakeside community may be quiet, but it's not blind. Mrs. Lipton from 2 cabins down had appeared on her porch with her phone, already recording, narrating the scene like she was auditioning for Dateline, HOA edition. Other neighbors peeked out from porches, some holding coffee, others clutching curiosity like popcorn. Whispers started flying. "That's her son, right? Didn't he install a swing set last week pretending to be a safety inspector?" The air was thick, not just with tension, but with the recognition that we were no longer isolated victims of Janice's clipboard crusade. This was theater, and the curtain had just risen on her most embarrassing act yet. When Chase's voice cracked as he said, "Mom, I don't want to lie again," every phone in earshot started recording. Truth, it turns out, makes great content. Officer Kane's tone shifted. He wasn't amused anymore. "Son, are you a certified surveyor by the state?" Chase looked like he wanted the earth to open up and swallow him whole. "No, sir," he whispered. "I'm not. I just wanted to help her." It was the kind of sentence that felt both heartbreaking and infuriating. You could see he was torn between loyalty and guilt, and for a moment, the only sound was the quiet click of Miss Lipton's phone switching to livestream mode. The moment wasn't just awkward, it was human. This kid, pulled into his mother's fantasy empire, was standing in front of a growing crowd of neighbors, police, and cell phones, admitting the whole thing was a lie. And still, Janice refused to back down. She crossed her arms, stared daggers at her son, and muttered, "Unbelievable." Not at herself for dragging him into it, but at him for breaking character. At that point, I stepped forward and showed Officer Kane the original property markers, two clearly visible stone boundaries that sat 3 feet inside where the fence ended. Chase's flimsy measuring wheel had somehow given 3 different readings for the same spot, and even Janice couldn't spin that. Officer Kane looked at the fence, then at Janice, and delivered a line I'll never forget. "Man, this is the 3rd time in a week I've been called out here. One more false report, and we're not talking about civil disputes anymore. We're talking charges." That landed. Even Janice flinched. The neighbors murmured, and someone whispered, "It's about time." But the real moment came when Chase looked at his mom, then at me, and finally at the officer and said, "I'm done. I can't do this anymore." His voice cracked again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was freedom. He took off the orange vest, dropped the measuring wheel, and walked away. In that instant, something changed. Not just for him, but for all of us. Because for the first time, someone inside Janice's world had broken ranks. It wasn't a neighbor arguing back. It was her own son saying no. And that kind of defiance is contagious. People on their porches weren't just watching anymore. They were witnessing the beginning of something bigger, a shift, a fracture in her made-up regime. Because if the clipboard army could lose its first soldier, maybe, just maybe, it was finally losing the war. That same evening, as I was nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee and wondering how much crazier things could get, there was a knock on my door. It wasn't Janice with another made-up citation, or her son holding another plastic measuring gadget. It was Grace Hollister. Grace had lived at Lake Echo longer than most property lines had existed. A silver-haired woman with a spine like steel and the world's best oatmeal cookies. She stood on my porch holding a Tupperware container in one hand and a thick manila folder in the other. "Sweetheart," she said in a voice that could disarm a bear, "I think it's time you saw what she's done to all of us." And just like that, the story stopped being about my fence. It became about everyone. We sat down at my kitchen table as Grace opened the folder like it was a court exhibit. Inside were documents going back 5 years, violation notices, fake invoices, bank deposit slips, and even minutes from long-forgotten community meetings. "This," she said, tapping a yellowed sheet, "is the dissolution paper from 2019. The Lake Echo HOA was legally shut down due to mismanagement. Ironically enough, Janice, it turned out, had never been president. Not officially. Not ever. When the HOA was still functioning, she was just a regular member, loud, controlling, and perpetually angry about things like porch wind chimes and mailbox paint colors. But once the real board gave up, she kept going, just without them. Like a movie villain who kept acting after the director yelled cut. And for 4 years, nobody challenged her, because fear makes a better leash than facts. As Grace flipped through the folder, she listed names and numbers like a seasoned prosecutor. 14 families. Each one paid her $200 a month in dues. That's over $10,000, 0 cents a year, all of it off the books. She pointed to receipts she'd collected from tearful neighbors. People too afraid to say no, too isolated to compare notes. Then came the stories. There was Ethel, the 71-year-old widow Janice fined $75, 0 cents for hanging an American flag without architectural approval. When Ethel refused to take it down, Janice threatened to have her property reassigned. There were the Millers, a young couple with a toddler, who were cited for having a deck that violated visual harmony standards. Grace shook her head. They sold their house 6 months later, said they couldn't handle the stress. Janice had turned a peaceful lake into a private game board, and she always played to win. But it wasn't just flags and decks. Grace had photographs of Janice holding her infamous cloth tape up to flower beds, measuring petunias for non-native species infractions. She fined the Pratts for growing lavender near their driveway, claiming it attracted unlicensed bees. I'm not making that up. Grace had copies of the notices formatted in Microsoft Word, complete with her made-up logo and font sizes only a tyrant would love. The worst part? No one had said anything. We all thought we were the only ones. The fence wasn't the trigger. It was the catalyst, like someone had finally flipped the porch light on, and we were all blinking at the same monster. Grace looked at me over her glasses and said she didn't want compliance, she wanted control. And that's when something inside me, something tired, something quiet, finally stood up. We didn't waste time. By the next evening, I'd invited every neighbor I could find to a quiet gathering by the lakeshore. No flyers, no announcements, just word of mouth and tired hearts. We had 12 families show up. We brought lawn chairs and bottled water. Grace brought cookies and evidence. And what happened next was nothing short of remarkable. People who hadn't spoken in years, who thought their neighbors were against them, started comparing stories. You got fined for your boat dock? She told us it was too wide. She said my fence was too green. She told me my son's bike was out of visual alignment. And somewhere between the laughter and the anger, we realized something terrifying and beautiful. None of us had been alone. We just didn't know it. For years, Janice had kept us divided by making us feel like outliers. But now we were connecting the dots. Her reign didn't just rest on fake rules. It thrived on our silence. That night we made a decision. We started a group chat. It wasn't fancy, just a bunch of adults finally realizing we had more power together than she ever had on her own. We shared files, we took screenshots, we archived videos, emails, and recordings. Even the former enablers came forward. One guy, Tom, who used to post Janice's fake notices on the bulletin board, said through tears, "I didn't fight because I didn't know we weren't alone." And that right there was the moment the fear shifted, not into rage, but into resolve. Janice had built her empire on intimidation and isolation. But now we were building something stronger, connection. She ruled with a clipboard, but now we ruled with truth and phone footage and cookies. The war wasn't over, but for the first time in years, the village had woken up, and the clipboard queen, she was starting to feel the heat. It started with a clipboard and ended with handcuffs, but in classic Janice fashion, she couldn't just lose quietly. No, she had to stage one final performance. 3 days after our lakeside meeting turned a bunch of weary neighbors into an organized resistance, I noticed some unusual movement across the road. Janice was in her driveway, coaching a young man into an oversized safety vest and handing him a clipboard like she was issuing a royal decree. That was Danny, her younger son. He looked about 20, maybe 21, with the unmistakable posture of someone who'd been roped into more than a few of his mom's delusions. She handed him a plastic ID badge that wouldn't have fooled a toddler and gave him a script to read. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read the panic on his face. This wasn't a routine. This was a final act of desperation, and the whole community could feel it. By 8:55 a.m., Danny approached my fence with the swagger of someone pretending not to sweat through polyester. "Sir, I'm here to perform a building code compliance inspection," he announced, voice cracking like a teenager caught sneaking out past curfew. He adjusted his too big hard hat, scribbled fake notes on a blank clipboard, and tapped the fence like he was testing for termites. Behind him, Janice filmed proudly from her porch like Spielberg on a power trip. I nodded, smiled, and offered him water. Internally, I was counting the minutes, because at 9 o'clock I am sharp. The real county inspector, Mr. Morales, was scheduled to arrive. And I wasn't the only one ready. Mrs. Lipton was already perched on her porch with her phone out. "We got a front row seat to Karen's last season finale," she whispered into the live stream, sending a ripple of excitement through the group chat. The atmosphere wasn't just tense, it was electric, like a courtroom drama, only with squirrels and lawn chairs. At exactly 9:03, a government truck rolled up. Mr. Morales stepped out, clipboard in hand, badge on his vest, and a calm look that said, "I've dealt with 5 of you before breakfast." He spotted Danny mid-inspection, tilted his head slightly, and said, "Excuse me, who are you?" Danny froze, like deer in headlights, pants on fire kind of frozen. I'm the inspector," he mumbled, backing away from the fence like it might betray him. Morales raised an eyebrow. "With which department?" That question unraveled Danny faster than a roll of duct tape in a wind tunnel. He looked at Janice, who gave him a nod that screamed, "Stick to the lie," but Danny had reached the end of the performance. "Mom, they're filming," he said under his breath, eyes darting to the cluster of neighbors now gathered with cameras rolling. "I'm done lying." He ripped off the vest, dropped the clipboard, and backed away. The crowd didn't cheer, but they didn't need to. His silence said it all. Morales didn't miss a beat. "Impersonating a county official is a felony in this state," he said calmly, motioning for Officer Kane, who had just pulled up like he'd gotten the popcorn text. Janice tried to jump in, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that Denny was training, and that they were just trying to protect the community. But her words bounced off Kane like a tennis ball against a steel door. "Ms. Bellamy," he said, voice flat, "this is the 4th call to this address in less than 2 weeks. Now we've got impersonation, false reporting, and recorded evidence. You have the right to remain silent." That last part was not a metaphor. Janice's jaw locked tight as Kane cuffed her gently but firmly. Danny didn't resist. He just looked relieved, like someone had finally popped the balloon he'd been trapped inside for years. Around us, neighbors stayed silent, cameras still rolling, bearing witness to justice with a quiet, collective exhale. As Morales conducted the actual inspection, I handed over the files, videos, emails, and witness statements from the entire community. Grace's paperwork, my recordings, the stream from Mrs. Lipton's phone, it was all packaged and ready. Morales reviewed it all with the efficiency of someone who'd been waiting for backup documentation to catch up with the rumors. When he finished checking the fence, he looked me square in the eye and said, "This is one of the cleanest builds I've seen all year. Structurally sound, 0 violations, textbook code compliance." Then he turned toward Janice's property. "Now it's time to inspect the inspector," he added with a dry smile. And just like that, the power shifted. The clipboard, the noise, the false threats, it all evaporated. Because it turns out the only thing her clipboard couldn't measure was accountability. And the tape she'd wrapped around the neighborhood for years, well, it was finally unraveling, one orange vest at a time. Janice left on a Tuesday. No speeches, no final rants. Just a moving truck, 2 men who looked like they'd seen better contracts, and Danny quietly carrying the last few boxes with his head down. No one helped. No one offered lemonade, and no one said goodbye. For a woman who once treated the street like her personal courtroom, the silence was poetic. Her cabin sold for $30,000 under market because, well, Google has a memory and live streams never forget. The listing might have boasted lake views and fresh paint, but buyers asked about that woman with the clipboard, and you could practically see their offers shrink by the minute. In the end, her reign didn't collapse in a blaze, it fizzled out like a sparkler in a rainstorm. And for once, the neighborhood felt like a neighborhood, not a hostage negotiation. Danny, to his credit, didn't vanish. He moved in with his aunt a few towns over and started sending updates through Grace, who had become our unofficial ambassador of second chances. Word was he'd started therapy and, this part really stuck, was enrolling in a certification program to become a real building inspector. "I want to do it the right way," he wrote in one message, "not like her." That one sentence was more honest than anything his mother had said in 4 years. Maybe the fence hadn't just stopped Janice. Maybe it gave her son something else, a reason to turn around. Funny how sometimes the people tangled in someone else's lies are the first ones to try and make something true. And around here, truth was finally the new HOA. A few days after the moving truck disappeared down the gravel road, Grace showed up again. No folder this time, just a tray of lemon bars and a grin. "I think it's time we reclaim this place," she said, as if she'd been waiting for the neighborhood to take a deep breath. That afternoon, folks started coming out of their cabins, dragging lawn chairs and coolers toward the lakeshore without a single flyer or invitation. It wasn't a party. It was a release valve. Kids rode bikes without measuring tape being waved at them. Mr. Torres played guitar on his porch again, no longer afraid of community noise violations. One family grilled burgers, another brought a pitcher of iced tea. Grace looked around, eyes misty, and said, "Nobody planned this. It just happened." That's what real community feels like, not rules and Comic Sans, is people showing up. We started holding real meetings, actual ones, with open conversations and shared goals. We decided we didn't need an HOA to tell us how to be good neighbors. Turns out, all it takes is a little listening, a little trust, and maybe a well-timed cookie tray. Some families that had moved away started visiting again. A few even talked about returning now that the dictatorship had packed up its clipboard. I finally got back to writing, too. No more shouting, no more surprise citations taped to my porch, just peace, coffee, and uninterrupted fiction. And every time I glanced out at that cedar fence, I didn't see a boundary. I saw a marker, not between lots, but between who we were and who we decided to become. In the end, it wasn't about the fence. Not really. It was about the fear that snuck in behind it, the silence that let it grow, and the moment a few stubborn planks of wood reminded us we could push back. That fence didn't just shield my windows, it blocked out years of nonsense, guilt, and groupthink. And now, as I sit here, months later, coffee in hand, laptop humming, lake calm, I think back to how this all started. Not with a scandal, not even with a fight, just a fence. A simple, legal fence meant to bring a little privacy that ended up exposing a whole ecosystem of control, fear, and silence. Funny, isn't it? Sometimes the smallest boundary can reveal the biggest truths. But if I've learned anything from Janice Bellamy, her fake tape measures, and her $2 justice letters, it's this. Real authority doesn't come from clipboards, it comes from community. And peace doesn't come from control, it comes from courage. The courage to speak up, to band together and to say, "This ends here." We didn't just survive Janice, we transformed because of her. Danny found a path forward. Grace became the heart of the neighborhood, and I finally finished my book. But more importantly, I learned something worth sharing. Silence makes tyrants powerful. But connection, that's what makes them powerless. And if one voice with a fence can rally a community, just imagine what your voice could do right where you live. So if this story hit home, if it reminded you of someone you know or a situation you've seen, don't keep it to yourself. Leave a comment below and tell us your story. Like the video if you believe in standing up to fake power. And make sure to subscribe, because these stories aren't just entertainment, they're reminders. That truth matters, that neighbors matter, that you matter. We've got more to tell, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Also, before we wrap, what would you like to see next? Got your own HOA horror story or a different kind of neighbor madness we should dig into? Drop it in the comments. Seriously, I read everything. Your idea might just become the next episode. The more stories you share, the more we expose. So don't forget to like, comment, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next tale that makes you laugh, shake your head, and maybe even stand a little taller in your own neighborhood. Because around here, we don't just tell stories. We build a community that knows better and fights smarter.